Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities website and teaching app. If you would like to beta test our website, you can go over to noetic.online, or you can stick with the beta version of the app in the App Store. Got a lot of new improvements coming for you, and your feedback is appreciated. Jennifer is going to be finishing off our seminar on Pride and Prejudice today, so I won't waste any more of your time and let her teach you.
Okay.
All right, Jennifer, take it away.
Okay. Well, the last time we did it was quite a while ago, and we're going to try it. We're going to motor through this sucker now. Okay. We were on chapter 6, volume 3rd, and we're in the midst of the Bennet family's great misfortune at learning that Lydia, the youngest daughter, has run off with the notorious and horrible Mr. Wickham. And thus far, all we know is that they are living in London together, and they are not married yet. So in chapter 6, everybody's still really anxious and waiting to hear back from Colonel Forster, who and from Mr. Gardner. Mr. Bennet's in London, and and the whole family is just up in arms. And so, so in the middle of all of this mess, they're discovering that Mr. Wickham had gaming debts. He had seduced half the girls in all the towns he's lived in, and he's just been a great philandering cad throughout his entire adult life. And in the middle of all of this, they get a letter from Mr. Collins, the great pompous reverend who is going to inherit Longbourn, and they get a letter from him basically saying that it would have almost been better if Lydia had died than for her to have run off with this person in this manner. And of course, this just makes everything worse. After they get this letter, they a few days pass, and they get something from Mr. Gardner saying that Mr. Wickham has left debts all over the place, and so and so basically they Mr. Bennett's already back in town. That's right, Mr. Bennett's already back, and they have a little conversation. Mr. Bennett and the remaining sisters, Jane, Kitty, and Mary, and Lizzie, and he basically tells first of all, he tells Lizzie that considering what has happened, I hope you bear me no ill will for not paying attention to you when you told me not to let Lydia go. And remember, Lizzie did tell him, don't let Lydia go. And now this has happened, and he says, so I apologize for having been wrong. And Kitty and he tells Kitty that, well, I'm never going to let you out again unless you're with your sisters. And if you're good for 10 years, I might take you to a military review. And he leaves it at that. And that's pretty much the end of chapter 6. At chapter 7, we get some more info. We get the letter that they've been waiting for from Mr. Gardner. This letter says that they have found Lydia. They know where Lydia is. They know where Wickham is, and he's discovered that it didn't seem to him that Wickham had any intention of marrying Lydia, but they are going to make sure that he does. And so the whole idea is that Mr. Bennet is going to take care of all of Mr. Wickham's debts in his area. Mr. Gardner and Mr. Colonel Forster is going to take care of all of his debts in Brighton, where the militia had been quartered. And he does have a great many debts. But and all that he's asking in return for this is what Lydia was already promised, as far as I think it was £1,000 that she gets when Mr. Bennet dies, and maybe I think it's $100 or £100 a year is all that he's asking in order to marry Lydia. Now, Mr. Bennet's confused by this because it seems like that's very, very low. Like, that is not a great price to ask for marrying a daughter that doesn't have any money to begin with. Just make sure my debts are taken care of and make sure she gets what she's owed. And so this really troubles Mr. Bennet. So, because to him, it means that Mr. Gardner had laid down a lot of money to make this happen. And he's just not telling anybody that he's done it. And so it strikes him as very odd. And he actually says that Wickham was a fool if he takes less than £10,000. And back in those days, £10,000 was an enormous amount of money. And so Mr. Bennet is really troubled by how in the world he's ever going to pay his brother-in-law back for all that money. But nevertheless, they're going to get married, no matter how awful Mr. Wickham is. They have to get married because they've been living in London. There's no other way. Now, and of course, Jane and Lizzie are really troubled by this, just like Mr. Bennet is. But Mrs. Bennet is just as happy as she can be. She's talking about wedding clothes. She's saying, why doesn't, your father needs to send Lizzie money so she can buy new clothes. And all she's worrying about is the clothes and the fact that her favorite daughter's getting married. And so all the other Lizzie and Jane and Mr. Bennet are all just sitting there mortified. And even Mrs. Bennet even tells the entire community, okay, Lydia's getting married, even though it would really be best to keep it quiet considering the scandal involved here. But in any case, that's pretty much all for chapter 7. Chapter 8, let me see here. Okay, so hang on just a second. Okay, they get another letter from Mr. Gardner later on, and we get a few more particulars about what's going on and what Mr. Bennet needs to do and all of this. And he says, oh, well, they're going to go, Mr. Wickham is going to be sent to Newcastle. He's going into the regulars. Now, just a quick information there, some quick information there is that Mr. Wickham was in the militia. The militia is the group of the military that takes care of home defense. They stay in England and they take care of they defend the smaller communities. He is about to go into the regulars, and what the regulars do is they are the more international soldiers. They're the ones that are sent to battle the French, and the regulars are more prestigious than the militia. So not only is Wickham getting all of his debts paid, but he is getting a more prestigious position out of this. And so we learn all of this, and Mr. Gardner says, well, they're going to go straight to Newcastle unless you decide to invite them to Longbourn. And of course, after a bit of a fight, Mr. Bennet says, no, we're not. And Mrs. Bennet says, yes, we are. And of course, Mrs. Bennet wins, and Lydia is set to come and see them. And so when Lydia shows up, Lydia is like, Jane and Lizzie are sure. They're hoping, and they think that Lydia is going to be so embarrassed by how much pain she has caused the family, by how much money she has cost Mr. Gardner and all these other people, that she's going to be more control, she's going to be quieter, and she's going to be a little bit more subdued, and she's going to have, they feel like she should have learned a lesson here. But she didn't. Of course she didn't. All she does is brag about how she's married now and her sisters aren't. She talks about Wickham and how she's so madly in love with him, and she wants to show everybody her wedding ring, and she's just basically bragging that she's married. And so everybody is just completely turned around by this. At one point, even Lizzie can't even stand to be in the same room with her, and so she has to leave because she's being that ridiculous. But in the midst of all this, while Lydia is visiting, Lydia lets slip that Mr. Darcy was at Lydia's wedding. And she's like, why in the world was Mr. Darcy at Lydia's wedding? And so she immediately writes a letter to Mrs. Gardner to find out what this is all about. And when she gets her letter, Mrs. Gardner tells Lizzie in her letter that not only was Mr. Darcy the one who found them in London, but Mr. Darcy is the one who's paying all of this money to make sure it happens. And he's the one who bought Wickham's commission in the regulars. He's the one that, and basically Darcy did all of this. And Lizzie can't even begin to account for this. And she like, some little voice in her says, well, maybe it's because of me. But she can't convince herself of that yet. But basically, Mrs. Gardner tells her all of this in a very long letter, and she also has to add, I really like him, by the way, Lizzie, and I kind of think that this is because of you. And so she kind of thinks it, but she's not entirely convinced that this is all Mr. Darcy. After she finds out about all of this, Mr. Wickham shows up to, they're still, the Mr. Wickham and Lydia are still at Longbourn, and so he comes across her while she's reading her letter. And so they have a little bit of a turn, and Lizzie kind of confronts Wickham about all the lies that he told her, basically, but she's very polite about it. She's like, oh, well, he starts the subject and said, while you were in Derbyshire, did you see this living, which was supposed to be where I was going to preach? And Lizzie says, well, I believe there was, I understand there might have been a time when you didn't think that was such a great prospect for you. And she basically corners him, and that shuts him up for good. He never mentions it again to her. And Lydia and Wickham leave not long after all of this. But Lizzie is still kind of torn up she's still kind of confused and awed by the fact that Mr. Darcy made all of this happen. And so after all of this, things get kind of calmer. And Mrs. Bennet is a little bit forlorn that Lydia is gone, and because Lydia was always her favorite. But then word starts to spread that Mr. Bingley is coming back to Netherfield. And this just starts a whole whirlwind in the family again, because Mrs. Bennet is like, even though she's trying to be cool about it to her neighbors, everybody knows that she still wants to get Jane in with Mr. Bingley. And Jane, of course, is very nervous about all of this, and so she's kind of altered when she hears about this. And when he does finally show up, when Bingley does show up in town, he doesn't. He comes and calls, and Mr. Darcy's with him, and Lizzie is kind of distraught, is kind of torn up about seeing Mr. Darcy too, because she knows that Darcy made all this happen for Lydia, but none of the rest of the family do, because she hasn't been told that she could tell them. And so she hasn't said anything. And so when Darcy's there, she's kind of wanting to read him and try to get a reaction to see, how he reacts to her and what he says. But he doesn't say anything. He's just completely quiet, and he doesn't say anything to her. And so she begins to think, well, maybe he's lost interest in me, because she has gotten to this point now, after learning about what he has done for her sister. She realizes, you know what? I probably should have said yes, and when he asked me to marry him before. And so she's kind of regretting it. But she's still kind of hoping he'll come back to it and ask her again. Although reasonably, she can't. She's trying not to hope too much. And so she kind of stays in a little bit of a funky mood. But when Mr. Bingley finally, Mrs. Bennet invites Bingley and Mr. Darcy to dinner, and again, she's waiting to see some reaction from Darcy, but she gets none. But she is gratified to see that Bingley is still obviously prefers Jane. He starts to talk to her again. He's always looking at her. They always sit together, and so everybody's a little bit heartened by this, that Mr. Bingley's visiting so often now. And while he's there, he does visit quite a lot, and they come to dinner. They have a party, and he shows up, and he brings Mr. Darcy to one of those dinners, and again, Lizzie is disappointed to get nothing from Darcy, but she is again happy to see that Mr. Bingley's paying attention to Jane again. And so after Mr. Darcy goes back to London, but Mr. Bingley stays, and Mr. Bingley starts to visit more often. Like, he'll come for tea kind of early in the morning and visit with the family. And after a couple of visits, everybody finally gets what they want as far as Bingley is concerned, and Bingley asks Jane to marry him. And so we get this finally Jane's going to marry Mr. Bingley. And Jane is just beside herself, and she's more happy that she's made her family happy than she is that she's happy, which is another example of how Jane is sort of this sweet, kind of selfless little soul. And she doesn't want to think badly of anybody. And so if anybody deserves to be happy, that's Jane. And so that's a good point that gets raised here with as far as Jane's character. And let me see here. Okay, and so now we have all of that taken care of. Jane and Bingley are going to get married. This is awesome. But Lizzie is Lizzie's really happy for Jane, but she still doesn't know what's going on with Darcy. And although she's sure that Mr. Bingley got permission from Darcy to ask Jane to marry him, she's a little bit sad that that Mr. Darcy hasn't shown her any attention. And so she's like, well, I'm happy for Jane, but dang it, I wish Darcy would come back and say something to me now. But before that happens, they have, after all this happiness with Bingley starts to visit the house every day. And whenever Jane's not around, Bingley talks to Lizzie, and whenever Bingley's not around, Jane talks to Lizzie. And so Lizzie's getting both sides of the happy couple here, while she's still kind of anxious about her own status. Um, and in the midst of all of this happiness for Jane, in waltzes Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Now, if you recall, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a very rich, very important woman, and she was married to a lord, and a lord is only second to nobility or to royalty. And so she's got nobility in her blood, and so does Mr. Darcy. And so Lady Catherine comes in and into the Bennet house, and so Mrs. Bennet sees this as a great honor, but it's actually quite the opposite, as Lizzie finds out when Lady Catherine suggests that they go take a walk together, just the two of them. And during this walk, Lady Catherine lights into Lizzie and extremely rudely speaks to her and says, I have heard an alarming report. I've heard that you are engaged to my nephew. And remember, her nephew is Darcy. And now, first of all, Lizzie's like, okay, number one, why in the world would she think this when it's not, when the last time he asked me to marry him was months ago, and I said no, and I doubt he said anything to anybody about it. And so she doesn't know where this is coming from, first of all. And second of all, Lady Catherine is basically insulting her right to her face. It's like, you're insolent. If you marry my nephew, none of us will ever talk to you. The shades of Pemberley will be polluted. You are, even though you are a gentleman's daughter, your mother comes from an obscure family, and her relatives are nothing. And so you need to promise me that that you need to tell me, first of all, you need to tell me that you are not engaged to him. And of course, Lizzie has to tell her, no, I'm not. And then she asks, will you promise me to never enter into an engagement with him, because he's engaged to my daughter, even though their engagement was sort of, it wasn't, the engagement between Anne de Bourgh and Mr. Darcy was never official, because even though two mothers may say, let's make sure our kids get married, even though that did often happen, there was nothing that legally bound them. So that there were no legal ramifications, and there wasn't even a societal ramification at this time for people betrothed from birth to not get married. It was just basically a wish of the parents, and it didn't always happen. And so, but Lady Catherine sees it as an absolute. I want this, so this is going to happen, because she's not used to being refused in any way. And so she asked Lizzie, do you promise to never become engaged to my nephew? And Lizzie says, I absolutely will not. And this is beyond Lady Catherine. She's never been spoken to in this way. She has never been, nobody has ever told her no, but Lizzie just did. And so that's a good picture of Lizzie's character, is that even though she maintains her composure and she's always polite, she's strong-willed. She's not going to do anything she's not going to do anything for anybody just because they're rich and important. That doesn't matter to her. What matters to her is, how people treat each other, their character and all of that. And this doesn't make sense to Lady Catherine, because she's been bowed to and had people's noses stuck up her butt for her entire life. And so this is out of Lady Catherine's comprehension that this girl would tell her no. And so she immediately runs off in a huff. And she says, if if this ever happens, nobody's ever going to speak to you again. I'll make sure, and she's all these empty threats. But Lizzie is left with just completely befuddled by all of this. And so, because she doesn't know, why would anybody think I'm engaged to Mr. Darcy, first of all? And secondly, why would she come all this way just to tell me not to do it? I mean, unless she thought it might be possible. And so, it kind of, but at the same time, like, it kind of gives Lizzie hope, but it kind of dashes her hope, because she thinks that Lady Catherine is going to go straight to Darcy in London and tell him, I'm not going to let you marry this girl, and I'm not going to, excuse me, because I don't want you to marry this girl. And she thinks that Lady Catherine is going to appeal to Darcy's pride, to his meaner instincts. I believe she says it, meaner instinct or something like that. That she's going to, and so Lizzie thinks that Lady Catherine might convince him not to ever ask her to marry him again. And so she feels she's a little bit forlorn by this, but lo and behold, Mr. Darcy, she's expecting Mr. Bingley to get a letter from Darcy saying that I'm not going to be coming back to Netherfield like I planned to. I'm going to stay in London. Every day she expects Bingley to tell her that he got a letter from him saying this, but he never does. And Darcy eventually shows back up. And in between all of this, Mr. Bennet gets a letter from Mr. Collins. Letters from Mr. Collins are always so delightful. He gets a letter from Mr. Collins saying, well, I want to congratulate you about on your eldest daughter being engaged to Mr. Bingley, and I'm shocked that you let Lydia come back to your house for a visit. And I also want to warn you about something. That your second daughter, Lizzie, is about to marry one of the most illustrious personages in the land, I believe he puts it. And he says, but I warn you that his aunt does not look on it with a favorable eye. So he's warning Mr. Bennet that Lady Catherine is not happy. And of course, to Mr. Collins, if Lady Catherine's not happy, nobody's happy. But Mr. Bennet just thinks this is funny. He doesn't think anything of it, because he doesn't think anything of Lady Catherine's visit. He doesn't think anything about this rumor. He thinks it's just a rumor, so he thinks it's funny, and he thinks Lizzie will think it's funny. And so he stops her in the hall and says, "Hey, I got this letter, and you're going to laugh your butt off at this." And he tells her about all of this, but Lizzie's not really finding it funny. Lizzie's actually insulted, and it just kind of makes her feel worse about this whole idea in her head that Lady Catherine's going to convince Mr. Darcy not to ask her to marry him again. And so Lizzie's a little bit hurt by her father. And this little bit here is, although Lizzie and her father kind of get each other, she's kind of daddy's girl, because Lizzie's got she's got some of Mr. Bennet's wit. Like they both have a really dry kind of sardonic way of looking at things, and they appreciate that about each other. And so Lizzie's always really loved her father, but this makes her see the point that Mr. Darcy had made before in that letter that he wrote her after he asked her to marry him the first time. And she kind of sees where her father can be really insensitive sometimes, and the joke, and even if the joke's not going to be funny to somebody else, he doesn't care as long as it's funny to him. And so so you see the imperfections in her father as she sees them. But after all of this, there's some Mr. Bingley again is visiting Longbourn every day. And then when Mr. Darcy comes back, he starts to come with him. And so the first day that Darcy comes back, they go and take a walk. Mr. Bingley and Jane and Lizzie and Mr. Darcy and Kitty. And so they're all five of them kind of taking a walk. And Kitty says, "Hey, can I go talk to Mariah Lucas?" And so Darcy and Lizzie are left alone. And as soon as Darcy and Lizzie are left alone, Lizzie feels the need to say thank you to Mr. Darcy about what he had done for Lydia. And she thanks him, and Darcy says, "You know, if you're going to thank me for that, don't thank me for your family. Thank me for yourself. I did that for you. I only did this for you because I knew what it would do to you and your family, and I don't want that to happen. I don't want to see you in that kind of pain." And then he immediately asks her to marry him again. And so, hurrah, everybody gets what they want here. And and they have some conversation, kind of, they kind of clear the air about, how their relationship has gone, and they kind of make apologies to each other. And Darcy does confirm that the reason why his manners were so different when she came to Pemberley with her aunt and uncle was because of what she had said to him when he asked her to marry him the first time. And so Lizzie basically is the cause for Darcy kind of softening his manner. And this makes a point, and I think that Jane Austen's making a point here with these two characters getting together, is that differences are a good thing. It's like Lizzie can kind of chill Mr. Darcy out, and Darcy can sort of instill a bit more importance and manner, or a little bit more sophistication in Lizzie. And I think that's the point that she makes with this, with their relationship in any case. And the book ends basically with a really brief rundown of how they fare with all these other characters. They never invite Wickham to Pemberley after they get married. Of course, that would be completely insupportable. But Darcy says, okay, but Lydia can come and visit on occasion if she wants to, just not Wickham. Lady Catherine is incensed and refuses to speak to either of them for a very long time, until finally Darcy kind of chills her out and she comes and visits. The Gardiners and the Darcys remain very close because Darcy is genuinely very fond of the Gardiners, which is again a good common ground for Darcy and Elizabeth, because the Gardiners, they both admire the Gardiners because they're intelligent. It's not about money with the Gardners, it's their intelligence and their integrity that they admire. And so, and that's pretty much the end of the book. So just to kind of review with the whole thing, something that a lot of people forget is that Jane Austen is a satirist. She does satire. This is, yes, it's a love story, and she's making a point with the love story. But all of these manners, a lot of these characters like Mrs. Bennet and Lady Catherine, these characters are satirical characters. As Jane Austen lived in this time where personality and integrity didn't count for a lot. Even education really didn't count for a lot. What counted in this society was money and title. And even if the highest lord is a supreme idiot, people are going to want to find favor with him. And like Catherine,
doesn't really sound like very much has changed.
yeah, yes, exactly, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because a lot of times, because even today, if people, all that seems to matter with a lot of folks is money. Success equals money. Success does not equal satisfaction. Success does not equal even happiness, really. For in a lot of cases, but I think things have gotten a little bit more chill about that these days, because you know the even the lines are blurrier now. The lines between classes are a bit blurred, but we still have a class system. Every country in the world has a class system, whether they deny it, whether they think they do or not. And that's what this novel is about. It's trying to make a point of, when you focus too much on class, when you focus too much on money and importance, you miss things. When you focus too much on trying to present yourself in a certain way, you're missing out. And because Lizzie, a lot of people say, oh, well, Mr. Darcy was the prideful one and Lizzie is the prejudiced one, but it's really kind of both. They're both prideful and prejudiced. Darcy, pride is more obvious with Darcy. He is proud of his standing. He's proud of his money. He's proud of his rank, and but he's also prejudiced against people like Lizzie, who are not quite as important, who don't have that much money. And he finds out that he was wrong on both counts. Lizzie is prejudiced against Mr. Darcy because she immediately sees him as this haughty, high and mighty dude. It's like somebody like me, or as any ordinary Joe likes to make fun of his boss, and so she immediately thinks that because he's got this air about him, that's all he is. All he is his rank. There's nothing else to him. But she's also prideful of her own ability to read character, of her own wit, of her own beauty, and so it's both of them are prideful and prejudiced, and in the society that Jane Austen lived in, that was the way of life. The gentry, that was all the gentry was about, was pride and prejudice. And so, so anyone who has read this book and has not looked at it as a satire needs to read it again and look at it as a satire. She is making fun of things that existed in her day. She is pointing out it's what's the word I'm looking for? She's pointing out the hypocrisy of the society that she lived in. And so the next time you read Pride and Prejudice, keep in mind, this is satire. This is not just a romance about, a rich dude and a poor girl. This is satire. This is a look at a time when appearance and money was everything, even more so than it is today. It's pretty bad these days, but it was even worse back then. So there you go. And I guess that's it. So at this point in the classroom, I say, do you have any questions?
No, I think you did an expert job at explaining this text. And I want to let everybody know that Jennifer and I are going to be embarking on some new missions, which we're both very excited about. We're going to set aside novels for a little bit, and we're going to collaboratively diagnose and analyze some of Jennifer's favorite poems and poets. So I'm a big fan. I don't really have an opportunity to do that as much as I would like, and so I'm really looking forward to that opportunity, and I'm sure others will as well. Yeah. Do you want to give a preview of some of the poets that you might be considering discussing?
Well, it's like I don't know exactly yet, because
we talked about one that we sort of agreed upon that would be interesting for the both of us would be Yeats.
Yes, I love William Butler Yeats. William Butler Yeats, one of my favorite things about him is his ability to write these absolutely beautiful verses without making it too sing-songy. He just has this marvelous way of being poetical or being poetic without making it obvious. That
Right.
He's not going to use a lot of highfalutin language. He's not going to be too flowery, but he uses these simpler words and phrases just beautifully. And one of my favorite poems of his is a poem called A Drinking Song. It's only 6 lines long,
Right.
but it paints such a vivid picture with those 6 lines, and it's so simple, but it's just amazing to me how he did that. But in any case, in general, I'm probably going to be looking through some poems and just kind of coming across some that I really like, and we'll see what
I'm putting her a little bit on the spot. We've got a couple weeks to figure it out. So I want to thank everyone for attending our virtual seminar and for Jennifer being our instructor. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful night, everyone. All right.